Welcome back here with Goldberg. Today I wanted to talk about something that you notice with political discourse in the United States. Folks tend to change and twist rules based upon which side they align with, and essentially they'll make a claim and throw it at another person, but they can't even defend themselves on the same subject. So I've noticed a lot of people in the YouTube sphere that is broadly pro-Trump, right-wing in general, making this claim, not even in a jest anymore, but they're doing it seriously, where they'll say, Bernie Sanders wants us to be like Venezuela. If we do Bernie Sanders programs, we're going to be going towards Venezuela. And you're like, okay, I don't think they realize, or they're just doing it, deliberately and they don't care, how intellectually lazy that type of statement is. It demonstrates that you haven't actually read anything, that you're refusing to, in fact, because the information is out there. The United States is not a petrostate. And of course, why aren't those Nordic countries going down the drain, and having food shortages and civil war? Yeah, it's true that Sweden has a suicidal migration policy, but if you take that out of the mix, it's not really viewed as a place where no one wants to go to Sweden. It's not Somalia or anything close to that. So, attached to that question, you'll get these conservatives and Republicans who will pretend that military spending is not socialistic, it's not big government. And some guy made this claim like a month ago or so, and his argument was basically, it's not. You can't say that. Like, where do you get this idea? If military spending that the Republicans and conservatives endorse is not, perhaps not Maoist-style socialism, of course, but we can use the Mitt Romney cop-out. You are big spending liberals who get your inspiration from the socialist Democrats of Europe. I don't know why people are so touchy on this particular subject. It's not like I really care. I think any person operating within the bounds of a compromise-based democracy is going to be a little bit socialist. And trying to pretend you're some kind of purist and we're not going to be a socialist country is cringeworthy and ridiculous. And you look at the actual record of these so-called conservative and center-right politicians. So, just to give a little bit of context for a second, in 1989, the CIA estimated that if you took all the rubles that the Soviets were spending on defense, it was like $200 billion. Our Pentagon budget at the same time was $300 billion. So we were already surpassing the Soviets. I think today we spend 17% of the budget on defense in the military. The Soviets at the time were spending about the same. There is another figure I saw that in the Cold War, like a third of our economy was the military and defense. I don't know if that's accurate. That might be a little bit exaggerated. If you look at Venezuela in 2007 under Chavez, depending on the figure, it's either $2 billion out of like $200 billion of their budget or $4 billion. So between, I guess that would be 1 to 2%. There's debate over whether you can count certain things as military spending. So we're up there, right? We're spending a lot. Even back in the 80s, we were spending a hell of a lot on defense, but it's not socialist. It's not liberal spending policy. It's not socialist. Why? Well, we're still trying to figure that out. Some of the arguments I've heard, some are kind of silly, but nonetheless we'll go through them. They include stuff like military spending is patriotic. Okay, I guess you could say that. Not all the money that we spend in the military defense goes to the troops, okay? It might go to military aid for Israel. It might go to maintaining bases around the world we don't really need. In fact, there is an argument to be made, and I've done so before, that a lot of our military spending is used to protect our fragile socialist monetary policy. Because, yeah, we print a bunch of money. We should not. You think a lot of people wouldn't trust the faith and credit of the United States, but of course we can be around the world and mess up your day pretty quickly, so we can kind of intimidate people. The security that we provide is an incentive for people to keep us as the reserve currency, to trust us when it comes to the money that we print and whatnot. But of course, most socialist countries that have been militaristic would claim they're patriotic. The Soviets, it was Mother Russia. In the case of someone in South or Central America, Ortega, Chavez, they would claim we are nationalists and patriots. We are trying to create a sovereign bloc of countries that cannot be subverted by imperialist powers like the United States or the multinationals, the oil companies. A lot of it's going to be based upon point of view. But this is why, and I'll be doing a video on nationalism because there's another issue where people don't really take into account context or different perspectives. It's going to be based upon your own interests and where you stand, and it does not mean that it's going to perfectly align. But to claim that if you're a socialist country, you're not really patriotic if you invest in the military because it doesn't count, I think that's a silly argument. That's one of the weaker ones, to be sure. This folds into the next point, which is, oh, well, military spending protects the country. Yeah, I guess to a certain extent, if you have, like, you're investing to ensure that you're not overrun in space. You're maintaining a certain amount of defense so China can't overrun you. Excuse me, just getting some water. But that's where you get to have a problem, because Bernie Booty Boy could come out and say, well, I believe that expanding healthcare is protecting the country. We can have debates over whether Medicare for all is actually good, if it's actually lowering costs, but in principle, the argument is less medical bankruptcies, more of a unified healthcare system, cheaper healthcare. Yeah, he could make the argument that it's protecting the country. Just like, education being more accessible. Oh yeah, well, we don't have graduates who are in debt and have to compete for slave wages with foreign workers. It's another thing I've talked about before. In 2008, there was an argument that instead of bailing out Wall Street, you should go and pay off everyone's mortgage. Well, that's socialism. Well, but on the flip side, you have to support these companies because they employ people. So which is more important? Someone getting a paycheck or someone not having to spend it? That's, again, a debate. So protecting the country, it's always going to be subjective. Some people would claim more social democracy in the United States would do more for the health of the country going forward. Or if you passed laws for further regulation of factory farms, so our food supply is safer. It's all going to come down to the context. But if you break everything to, no, it's socialist because it's the government doing this and the government shouldn't do that, but the government can give money to these companies, people are going to call it out and say it's not really consistent. And yes, a lot of companies, including defense companies, they want the government to keep spending money so they can make money. Are they not welfare dependents? Again, it all comes down to how you're going to look at the economic system. Now, you get to another point here where they will say stuff like, the difference between the United States and the socialist countries is that in the United States, the spending is for innovation and, it's real quality production, whereas the socialists was all Potemkin villages, there was all garbage, it didn't actually work properly. This argument doesn't work either, because in the Soviet Union, you could get incentives, financial incentives. In fact, it was usually in the realm of like science or military development that people were rewarded. Of course, one of the best and most versatile assault weapons ever created, the AK-47, the Kalashnikov, the guy who developed it, Mikhail Kalashnikov, he was made a member of the Politburo, he got more money, he actually could afford a car. He wasn't a Wall Street billionaire, but you get the picture. They did provide means by which people could rise up if they contributed a lot to the society, to Mother Russia or whatever. The AK-47, just for some context here, when the Marines were in Vietnam, a lot of them refused to use the M16 in the early days because, on the flip side, we had given Armalite a contract and they said, this gun will not need to be cleaned, which was a joke. And so the things kept malfunctioning. So you had a private company doing a terrible job, arguably costing the lives of a lot of soldiers. You had the guy in the socialist system who created a great product, which even today, the ones that have been manufactured in the 50s still in many cases function properly. So it's not true that just because it's a socialist government doing it, the quality's bad, and if you have the private sector, if you contract, it's going to be better. So in the case of like Armalite was doing the worst product, which is kind of like a stereotypically socialistic thing. It doesn't work. The socialists were creating a better product. How do you figure that? My point is that nothing's always going to be a hard and fast rule at all times. Other examples, the F-35, lots of criticism of it. Is the fighter jet even effective? It's cost so much money. It's a big boondoggle. This happened under a relatively capitalist system. I think it was Bush that began the program to pay for that. So just because we're not officially socialist does not mean that we act socialist, even in the interests of the military spending. And then you had with Iraq, you can read Byron Dorgan's book on this. Halliburton, Brown and Root, they were getting these billion-dollar contracts. Hey, build health clinics in Iraq. They didn't build all of them. They built the ones out of really poor quality materials. They were supposed to build shower stalls for troops. Troops were getting like reactions and rashes from the water because it was not meant to be used for that. There were pallets of cash disappearing in Iraq. This is stuff like supporting the military, private companies, and yet they're ripping off the government. They're acting like socialists, basically stealing money from the treasury, making off in the night, and then leaving taxpayers with a bill. A lot of the stereotypes, what people criticize about socialist regimes, happen in the name of defense. We've got to protect the country. My point is, yes, a lot of defense spending is going to be socialist in nature. It's going to have that mentality of basically, let's take what we can get, let's not deliver, and let's just run away in the sunset and leave the country to collapse financially. And then finally we get to this other point where they will go, well, yeah, but you see, in the United States, the military spending, the government doesn't control the means of production, which is different from a socialist country. And it's like, okay, I guess you've got a point there. Now, let's just consider this a little bit more directly. I've noted before how much of the GDP is the government. But as you saw back in 2013, when Rafael Cruz got angry about Obamacare, he shut down the government, there was the sequester. And so the companies that made the planes, the warfighter jets, the companies that made the boats, the submarines, the aircraft carriers, they were laying off people. Just like in the government shutdown, there were people, we're not paying you, we're laying you off. Why? Because the government is their lifeline. So if the government isn't owning the means of production, then the government is writing the check for the means of production. The government is funding the factories so they keep operating. We need to stop being naive. I'm not saying this is, haha, you're all socialists. I'm just pointing out, you may not be in the Maoist camp, but if you support this military spending without oversight, without review, you are not in any sense like a real conservative. You're not opposing socialism. You may not be going down the path in terms of, handouts to people. You're just marching down that path with handouts to corporations and the military-industrial complex. I guess in the context of where we are now, it's almost like pick what you want, which is better, which is worse, and then vote for it and hope you get what you're asking for. So, yes, the military, perhaps not exclusively, but a lot of military spending does come down to essentially either socialism or big spending liberalism, as Romney would say.